If you're planning a trip to Europe in 2025, you can walk in the footsteps of the Anzacs. Our Western Front Explorer Tour spends 4 days exploring all the Australian battlefields from the First World War in the Somme, the Ypres Salient and Flanders. This is the only Australian tour that begins and ends in Paris, so it's a really great way to see those famous battlefields. Now, the Western Front Explorer Tour departs weekly between April and November, and it includes accommodation in the heart of the battlefields, deluxe transportation, and a range of extras that you only get on a Mat McLachlan tour. And like all our tours, you'll be escorted by one of our expert historians who will bring the story of the Anzacs to life. This itinerary has been personally designed by me, and all the historians are my friends and colleagues, and I've handpicked them to lead these tours. This really is a brilliant way to see the battlefields. It's the 4-day Explorer Tour, departing weekly from Paris, and for more information, you can visit battlefields.com.au.
Weight loss. It needs to be fast and sustainable. Noom GLP-1 starts at just $149 and ships to your door in 7 days. Take it from Lauren, who lost 22 pounds on Noom.
If I come off of the GLP-1, it's not going to automatically make my weight yo-yo back.
$149 GLP-1s? Now that's Noom smart. Get started at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. Individual results may vary. Not all customers will medically qualify for prescription medications. Compounded medications are not reviewed by the FDA for safety, efficacy, or quality.
There's one thing that will forever change the way you sleep, and it's the softest 100% organic cotton bedding from Boll & Branch. You'll fall asleep faster wrapped in the most luxurious comfort. You'll never sleep hot again with airy blankets, cloud-like duvets, and breathable sheets. You'll experience pure comfort on night one and feel your bedding get softer with every wash. Discover the difference with 15% off your first order at bollandbranch.com with code BUTTERY. Exclusions apply. See site for details. Thumbtack presents the ins and outs of caring for your home. Out. Uncertainty. Self-doubt. Stressing about not knowing where to start. In. Plans and guides that make it easy to get home projects done. Out. Word art. Sorry, live, laugh lovers. In. Knowing what to do, when to do it, and who to hire. Start caring for your home with confidence. Download Thumbtack today.
A Living History production.
This is the Living History Podcast, broadcasting live across the airwaves.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Living History, a really interesting one we're going to be doing this week. It's a topic very close to my heart. It has been ever since I was a kid. We're going to be talking about the Battle of Iwo Jima, a very famous battle in the Pacific War, which its anniversary is coming up. Believe it or not, 80 years since Iwo Jima. It was the start of 45. So this month marks the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Iwo Jima. And really, this was just a convenient excuse to get someone back on the podcast that I love having on the podcast. It's someone we've had before. You would have heard many interesting conversations I've had with him. It's John McManus. John, thank you so much for joining us again.
Well, Matt, I'm just glad there is an excuse because it's just such a pleasure always to be on your podcast and just to catch up with you. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I agree, mate. We were talking just before we started recording about the We Have Ways Festival, which hopefully we're going to catch up at again in the UK in September, and a few options for presentations we might do there. So it's great to get to talk to you on the podcast, but even better to meet you in person. So if anyone listening to this is planning to be in the UK in September, definitely check out the We Have Ways Festival. It's a fantastic World War II event that goes for a weekend. I think it's the middle of September that it's on this year. So certainly check that out, and also check out the podcast that John does, which is We Have Ways USA with Jim Holland and Al Murray. That's certainly worth listening to as well, particularly if you're interested in the US involvement in the Second World War. And I think we can't get away from that, John. I think when we step back, I know Australians are pretty parochial about our own involvement in the war, but when we step back and look at that big picture, we can't get away from the role that the US played in that Second World War. It really was a defining chapter for America, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a completely different America that comes out of World War II. Obviously, the country becomes a military and international superpower, an economic superpower on many levels. But arguably, it had already been an economic superpower. It just becomes much more involved internationally as a result of the war as a kind of world leader. And I would argue that there's no country that fights a global war to the extent the United States does. Obviously, I don't have to tell you, Australians are involved on every corner of the globe in this war, as are Britons, as are Canadians. But the United States really has to apportion major resources to all theaters on many levels. And we have really kind of full industrial power kicked in. So this has some really serious, consequences in the long run for this country. So the United States changes socially, it changes racially, in terms of gender, its economic development changes, and obviously its military involvement. I mean, you name it. So it is, I think, in my opinion, the seminal moment in our history. Many 19th century historians might disagree with me and think it's the U.S. Civil War, which I understand. But I think World War II really on many levels is more consequential.
Well, there was a big decisive moment too for America because the America of 1939 was different from the America of 1941. And there was a conscious decision from the whole nation to let's get involved. I mean, I think sometimes when we talk about history, we look back as if these were preordained, things that would happen. But that didn't have to be the case. America chose not to come into the war in 1939. And obviously the attack on Pearl Harbor, and this isn't going to be a long American World War II history lesson, but it was, I think it's worth saying, particularly in light of the America we see today, that it was a conscious decision to join the world and to do what it needed to do to rid the world of tyranny, as Americans often put it. So I think that was a fascinating change from early in the war to the time that America joined.
Yeah, it's a rare moment of consensus in American history. Obviously, Pearl Harbor, it has a lot to do with that. But, a Gallup poll taken in 1937 revealed that 70% of the American public thought involvement in World War I had been a mistake. So that meant a lot of the population was determined to stay out of World War II. Like you said, we, don't join in 1939. And at that moment, our army is smaller than Romania's army. So there had to be a pretty major kind of societal decision to go in a different direction. And really, it's the events of World War II as they unfold, especially the German conquest of much of France in 1940, that starts to change our thinking somewhat. And obviously, by the time Pearl Harbor happens, then you've got a sort of almost a revolutionary change on some levels. And so by 1945, when Iwo Jima happens, I mean, by then, this has been a country that is more or less united behind the war, but is getting war weary. It's two different things. So it's almost in a way like the North during the Civil War in that respect, that you certainly have a strong majority that wants to fight through to the end, but they're getting tired of the casualties, and the cost of the war too is certainly, a factor as well. So the United States is by 1945, really coming to the apogee of its power on many levels, and seeing a kind of a new, a kind of a new economic dimension that it hadn't even seen in the past to this level. But it didn't mean that the outcome of the war was going to be preordained, or that we were going to see it through to unconditional surrender, depending upon what happens. So this is what the Japanese have to fight for at that point, to stop us short of that complete conquest of Japan and unconditional surrender.
I think you could almost argue that the Japanese, in some ways, it's going to be a funny term, but they had the right idea, that they knew that America was getting weary of the casualties. They knew America was getting sick of the war, and that the social and economic costs that had put on America. And, part of this Japanese idea of, well, let's bleed them absolutely dry, in order to not just protect the Japanese homeland, but also to turn that tide. And if we can just hang on long enough, America can't go on with this forever. They're not going to, particularly if there was a violent invasion of the main islands of Japan, and the casualties that would have been incurred there. I think there's a grain of truth there. The American public probably would not have been as keen to sustain that war on an ongoing basis once they started seeing those casualties.
Probably not. And I think that's something that we tend to overlook in this day and age, 80 years on, when we know how the war turned out, and that kind of inevitability thesis of World War II, that the Allies are inevitably going to win, that I've always kind of pushed back against, because I think it doesn't take into account that national will dimension that comes from these massive casualties that are starting to happen, that obviously we've suffered in Europe by this point in time. But, the bodies are piling up in the Pacific too. And we've had some pretty serious bloodlettings by now. And Iwo Jima is a pretty stunning, pretty stunning battle on that level. And when a lot of people are getting really bad telegrams, this is certainly starting to wear away at our will to some extent. Fortunately, not enough, to change the outcome of the war. But you can imagine if we've got this major invasion of the home islands, that's going to be a completely different level. I'm glad that never happened, of course, and not just from an American point of view, from a Japanese point of view too, because if we were going to suffer, they were going to suffer 5-10 times more than the Americans ever would have. So it was best for everybody that didn't happen.
Well, it leads us into a discussion that I'll probably get you back on in August to talk about, which is obviously the atomic bombings, which, again, I think we look back and go, oh, that's just what happened. It ended the war. But I mean, these sort of conspiracy theories surrounding the atomic bombings have persisted to this day. And my quick summation at this point before we talk about Iwo is that an end to the war before an invasion of the Japanese mainland was, the home islands was going to be essential to reduce those casualties, as you say. But that's obviously that's a conversation for another time. We'll get you back on in August to talk about that in more detail as we approach that anniversary of the atomic bombings. But let's talk about Iwo Jima. So we've touched on that global positioning. Give us a bit more of some specifics about the strategy here. What was happening at this stage in the war? So we're talking February 1945. We're in the closing phase of the Pacific War. This is potentially the beginning of the end of the Pacific War. Give us the strategic overview of why this tiny little volcanic rock in the middle of the Pacific Ocean was even important to America.
Yeah, so by this point in the war, we've really begun to pierce the inner ring of Japan's defenses. And most notably, the Americans do that at the Marianas, in the Mariana Islands in the summer of 1944, which are really, that's really the game-changing campaign. And the reason is, of course, that we get bases from which the new B-29 superfortresses can bomb the Japanese home islands themselves. And of course, obviously, by the spring of 1945, that's going to mean fire bombings and whatever. But when that happens, of course, now Japan itself is in peril. And so the question now is, which direction do we go from there? And we're fighting desperately in the Philippines from October 1944 onward. To liberate the Philippines. And really that is, I would argue, kind of the nexus of the American war in the Pacific against Japan, because we fight two major campaigns there. And, the fighting there is just absolutely, horrendous. And so that's happening. That's like MacArthur's Ballywhack. So you have this kind of dual theater thing going on where MacArthur, Southwest Pacific area, which obviously, all about in Australia. And then we've got the Central Pacific, area under Nimitz, Admiral Nimitz, who's the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet. And so Nimitz's idea is to basically go straight at the heart of Japan. And Iwo Jima is one of the capstone operations toward that end. We've had, obviously, the campaign in the Marianas, before that, Tarawa, so on and so forth. So by that time, they've become convinced, the American war planners, that Iwo Jima becomes very important, like solid gold real estate, because of how it will affect the B-29 bombing campaign. The thinking is that the Japanese have early warning radar, that they have fighter planes stationed there that are going to cause serious issues for our bombers going back and forth. There's a hope that we can, if we capture the island, turn it into a emergency landing strip. Or perhaps even we'll base some of our own fighters, or maybe even fighter bombers there too, if we can grab it. There's 3 airfields on Iwo Jima. It's it's not a nice place, but it's just where it's located in the Pacific. It could become very important to control it, to strike at Japan, or at least to prevent the Japanese from harassing the B-29s and the American aerial bombing effort. So this is really the thinking from the kind of the late summer and early fall 1944 onward in Nimitz's retinue. This is not a MacArthur thing at all. So it's really the Navy's game at this point, and it is one of the very, very tiny few battles in our history that is almost exclusively Marine Corps. Now, it's not totally Marine Corps, but let's be honest, the Marines do most of the fighting and dying on the ground there. There's going to be an Army infantry regiment that's involved, the 147th, in the later stages, and it's no picnic for these guys. And there, of course, here and there, you're going to have Army Air Forces units that are stationed in the airfields once they're taken and whatnot. But it's really the battle is associated with the Marine Corps, and I think that's correct that it should be.
It's interesting, and again, a topic for another podcast, but I'd love to talk more about bombing in the Pacific, the bombing campaign in the Pacific, because a completely different beast to what was happening in the European theatre. The distances involved, the different types of aircraft involved, the resistance from the Japanese, the types of bombing. It's really a fascinating and really, overlooked chapter of the Second World War. And it does, as you say, bring to light the importance of Iwo Jima, because if we look on our map and draw a line, a lot of the bases were in Saipan and Tinian, where the bombers were heading off to hit Japan, and they got to fly straight past Iwo Jima, where, as you say, there was infrastructure there, airfields, radar, and that obviously was the intention of the Japanese, to set that up as a fighter interceptor a base to cut off those bombers on their way to Japan. So it's an absolutely essential part of the story of the Pacific War, but one we gets virtually no cover. I can't even think off the top of my head of a decent book to read about it, but the bombing campaign in the Pacific War, outside, of course, the atomic bombing. So it's is that an area of the Second World War you've done a lot of research on, John?
I've done some, but I'll tell you what, I think James Scott is the leading scholar on that. He just published a book called Black Snow, which is all about the first Tokyo raid. It's about more than that, but it really, I think, covers the first Tokyo firebombing raid, March 9th, 10th, 1945, like no source I've ever seen before. And so really he has become, I think, the leading scholar of the strategic bombing campaign against Japan. And I think, you talk about the destructive and graphic nature of that campaign. We are basically, if you think about it in the bigger picture, we are using fire on many levels to subdue Japan. Now, most famously, of course, the firebombing raids that are going to destroy most of Japan's cities by the end of this war and claim more lives than the atomic bombings, quite a bit more, and make more people homeless and whatever. But in the ground fighting, too, and Iwo Jima highlights this, we're using flamethrowers, at the infantry level, but for the first time with tanks, too. Flame tanks are going to be employed. So, and then, of course, engineers are sometimes just, we'd already seen this in the Philippines, and we'd seen it at Biak, too. Peleliu as well. Engineers just using, just pouring gasoline into Japanese-controlled caves and flaming them out that way. So I just think it's kind of interesting. This hyper-modern war uses one of humanity's oldest weapons. We've all learned about Greek fire in the old days of naval history and whatever. So here we have a new kind of fire used here. So no, I would point anybody to James Scott's work, which is remarkable. And he's actually doing new work on the atomic bombings, which I think is in great need of revision too. To get around a bigger picture of that as well.
Picture this, you're halfway through a DIY car fix, tools scattered everywhere, and boom, you realise you're missing a part. It's okay, because you know whatever it is, it's on eBay. They've got everything, brakes, headlights, cold air intakes, whatever you need, and it's guaranteed to fit, which means no more crossing your fingers and hoping you ordered the right thing. All the parts you need at prices you'll love, guaranteed to fit every time. eBay, things people love.
Enjoy a brilliant sleep experience with Soundcore from Anchor. Stressed out by your partner's snoring? Having trouble falling asleep? Waking up too easily? Suffering from poor quality sleep? Now, put on Soundcore Sleep A20 earbuds. Experience unparalleled pressure-free comfort perfect for side sleepers. Choose your favorite sound in your curated playlist. Feel your body getting lighter and lighter and enjoy a full night of peaceful sleep with the A20's long-lasting battery. Then wake up feeling fresh with a personal built-in alarm. Get the sleep you deserve with Soundcore Sleep A20 earbuds. Discover more on soundcore.com. SOUNDCORE. Soundcore. Use code SLEEP at checkout to get $30 off. SLEEP in all caps.
John, it never ceases to amaze me how every time I read about the Pacific War, the new level of horror that greets me when I study it. And not to take anything away, obviously, from the European theatre or anything else that was going on. Obviously, this was a horrific war at every level. But just from a human capacity, what the people had to go through in the Pacific, it defies understanding and imagination, which is why I think it's so important that we remember, particularly on these anniversaries, because I think it's the European story I've always found, particularly if you talk about in the public perception, is a lot easier to understand. The Nazi story is easy to understand. The goodies versus baddies, the relative compactness of this region compared to what was going on in the Pacific. There was mostly ground fighting, in the ground and air in Europe, but then in the Pacific you've got all the elements of the service brought in. It's such a complicated story. It wasn't the same people. If you'd listed the day of Pearl Harbor and then were still there during the atomic bombings, you would not have fought in every campaign. You probably still wouldn't be fighting. It's such a broad and complicated story. But I think that's why on anniversaries like this one we're discussing, that we do drill down, and perhaps that's the key to unpacking the full story of the Pacific, is to drill down on these key moments, expand on them, and put them in context. So I'm really glad we're doing, having a discussion like this one.
Yeah, I think. Excuse me, let me get a sip of water. I think even more than Europe, it's an imperial war. I mean, that's been a big player as to why this has happened. Obviously, the Western involvement in China, which has led to conflict with Japan on many levels. Japan's imperial expansion, U.S. imperial presence in the Philippines, in the Hawaiian Islands, I mean, wherever it would be, all of that is kind of leading to these clashes and the Japanese wanting to upset the balance of power. So I think in that sense, it's not as uplifting a story in a way as stopping the Nazis or whatever. It's kind of hardcore power politics on many levels. And of course it was in Europe too, but maybe more overtly. But I think the other thing that's unsettling about the Pacific Asia War is the racial element. Just the level of savagery and racial hatred on both sides. But honestly, I think more on the Western side against the Japanese than vice versa. And I'm basing that on my own research into, of course, the American soldiers of the time. Not always what's laundered 60 years later when a veteran knows that he's not supposed to say certain things about the Japanese, or perhaps has changed his views, But at the time, it's quite unvarnished in letters home, in diaries and whatever, of just really, racially pejorative terms and a lot of overt racism that you see there that grows out of the anger over Pearl Harbor and the Japanese, true barbarism in this war, the way they behaved often. It led to an even greater racial hatred, I think. And I think sometimes that's very uncomfortable to look at ourselves in that lens. I think can be very difficult. And also too, from a Western perspective, again, a lot of these places in Europe, we know pretty well. I mean, we can really relate to going and taking Rome. We can relate to Normandy or whatever from a Western perspective, I guess. I don't know that Iwo Jima or Tarawa or Buna or wherever it happens to be resonates the same way. And these were places that some of them became important just because of the struggle between these nations at war. They were not places we really wanted for their own sake in the same way we do in liberating Paris or something, So I think that on that level, it's not quite as, uplifting a story, I suppose.
It's probably not as sexy either, to use that term poorly.
Yeah.
The idea of marching into Paris, the idea of liberating Rome, the idea of, the march even into Germany, and taking Berlin. And, these are iconic European cities. But people cannot be blamed for scratching their head and going, why was a little volcanic rock called Iwo Jima even worth, the cost in lives? And hopefully we've put that in some sort of context with our previous discussion. But let's talk about it. Let's talk about what happened on Iwo Jima. And just, it certainly must rate as one of the most horrific battles of the Pacific War. It's certainly hard to rank them because they're all pretty horrific. But this one, if you're talking just horrific fighting, Iwo Jima must be way at the top of that list. So tell us a little bit about what happened when the Americans went in.
Yeah, this one's really bad. So the main naval force that is going to Iwo Jima is the Fifth Fleet under Admiral Raymond Spruance, of course, has really seen a lot of action in this war. He's got basically a Marine task force, but the fighting component of that is a Marine amphibious corps under Harry Schmidt, who had been a division commander, now is promoted. He's got 3 Marine divisions under his command, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th. And it's the 4th and 5th that are going to assault Iwo Jima, and there's really only one place to assault. I'm sure everybody's seen the famous pictures of Mount Suribachi, and then you have this narrow strip of beach alongside. It's not a big place. So you're going to have two divisions land on that first day, February 19th, 1945, and this is following months of air raids against Iwo Jima, the mainly Army Air Forces air raids that have tried to degrade the Japanese defenders there. And of course, then famously or infamously, the fleet is not going to bombard Iwo Jima as long as the Marines would have wanted. They wanted at least a 10-day bombardment, which of course takes away the element of surprise, but we'd done that in the Pacific War. That wouldn't have necessarily been new, and you didn't necessarily have to worry about too much Japanese aerial response or sea response, because obviously they had lost some pretty major battles by this point, like the Battle of Leyte Gulf and whatever.
And it's not like they could reinforce, is it? Like, it's not like even if they knew the battle was coming, what are they going to do? They're not going to be able to bring in extra troops and extra guns.
Exactly.
They were very limited in the response, particularly if the American Navy is ringing the island.
That's right. I mean, they've kind of got what they got there, and that's right. So, I mean, you have to worry about them, and the kamikazes are going to be in play in the Battle of Iwo Jima. Not like Okinawa, of course, but they're going to sink a light carrier, and they're going to damage, I think, I don't know, one of our fleet carriers, I think Saratoga. But so you got to worry about it a little bit, but it's not going to be able to stop the fleet there. So the Marines thought that there should have been a longer bombardment, and maybe that's true. But given the nature of Japanese defenses, which are largely underground or embedded in Mount Suribachi, or so heavily dug in bunkers, I don't know that they would have done all that much more damage, but of course that's debatable. But so, yeah, they go in with the two divisions, and when they land initially, the Japanese just kind of let them ashore and let them advance inland, and the soil is volcanic ash, so it's hard to walk on it, hard to move vehicles on it. It's easy to get kind of enmeshed in it, almost not quite like quicksand, but sort of, kind of similar. And so they move into the pre-prepared kill zones, most of the leading units, and then they just get nailed in this crossfire. So here we have a kind of a Japanese doctrine that's in place now that recognizes when we invade a place, we're probably going to get ashore. They're not going to stop us at the waterline and push us back into the sea and foil the whole thing altogether like they had hoped to earlier in the war, famously like at Tarawa. We're going to get ashore, so it makes more sense to just fight inland, and like you said earlier, Matt, to just bleed us. And we'd already seen this at Biak in May and June 1944. We had seen it famously at Peleliu, of course. We had seen it at Leyte, and we had seen it at Luzon by now. And we will later see it at Okinawa. Now, the Japanese, of course, have their disagreements among themselves, and some aren't on board, and you're going to have outliers and in those places. But largely, that's what they're pivoting to by now, and that's really more dangerous. From my perspective, say, as an infantry marine or whatever, I mean, now the Japanese are really hunkered down and can really do damage to me versus launching these attacks straight into our firepower, which really works to American advantage.
John, how was the intelligence before Iwo Jima? Because, as you say, we'd seen this at Peleliu, we'd seen it in other battles. Did the Americans know what they were getting in for? Did they know that the Japanese were mostly going to be underground? Did they know that it was likely that it would be a long, protracted campaign where the Japanese would, appear in a cave and then disappear? Or did the Marines hit the beach completely unprepared for what they encountered?
I mean, on the intel side, we have really no idea what's coming. And that's another theme that we see far too often in the Pacific Asia War. We just don't know what we're getting into. It'll be kind of the same thing at Okinawa about a month or so later in April 1945. It's the same thing at Biak that I mentioned earlier. I mean, Peleliu. When the Americans go in there, they think they're probably in for a pretty sharp 5 to 7 day battle. They figure, we're going to go in, they're going to try and stop us at the waterline, and then we're really going to nail them when they counterattack and do their banzai attacks or whatever. And I'm just amazed that any American commander would think that at this stage of the war. So Holland Smith, who's the task force commander, it's kind of an administrative position, but he's there and he's been in this war for several years, and he gives a briefing to the press before the invasion, and he talks exactly about how here's what we expect. They're going to try and stop us right at the waterline. They're going to make sure that we don't get ashore. They're going to foil us if they can. And then they're just going to bonsai us. And I can't help but think to myself, hey, did you study any of the previous battles that had just happened? Did you look at anything that was going on, in the Philippines or at Peleliu? Whereas General Kuribayashi, who is, of course, the Japanese commander in Iwo, I mean, he had studied what Colonel Nakagawa, the commander at Peleliu, had done, and really tries to replicate that, and he will, because he's got more people, he's got better terrain for it, it's a bigger battleground on some levels, and so it's easy for me to say, I guess, 80 years later, but I'm just astounded at how bad the intel was on in that respect of not really studying what the Japanese had done recently and figuring they're probably going to do that again.
It seems extraordinary, doesn't it? I mean, we've had discussions on this podcast about earlier battles in the Pacific War, but this is now the 5th year of America's war in the Pacific. And it seems quite extraordinary, particularly considering what had happened at places like Tarawa and Peleliu, and just the demonstration of the cost that the Japanese could make the Americans pay to protect that ground. You mentioned it was the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions that were going to be landing here. What was their experience level before Iwo Jima?
So the 5th Marine Division was new into battle. The 4th Marine Division had fought at Roynamur and at Saipan, so they had quite a bit of combat experience. The 3rd Marine Division, the reserve unit, had also had a lot of combat experience. Bougainville in 1943, obviously at Guam. They had fought a heck of a battle in Guam. Speaking of bonsai attacks, they had absolutely slaughtered the Japanese in a major battle there shortly after the American invasion in July 1944. And that was like the last time the Japanese were operating that way, and they really paid the price for it because it crushed most effective resistance for the Japanese on Guam. So the 3rd Marine Division is pretty well schooled too. And I should even say in the 5th Marine Division, you have combat experienced Marines who are part of that unit. These are just really 3 outstanding units, I would argue, and they go in, as is often typical, they go in to the invasion overstrength, sometimes in the rifle company, and they were going to need it. Like 235 Marines or whatever. They were going to need that manpower because this is so casualty intensive. Almost from about an hour after H hour from that point forward, you're just basically in a kill zone. And it's just a matter of how you're going to deal with this. A lot of your supporting firepower is not that effective because they're in caves, they're underground. There's a lot of, later on we'll call this backfilling. As you gain ground, especially in an urban combat setting, the enemy pops up behind you or in places you thought you had secured. This becomes the pattern on Iwo Jima, that we have this distressingly common situation where we think we've cleaned out, a trench line, a bunker complex, part of Mount Suribachi, whatever it is. And then here they are again, because they have a lot of tunnels that they have spent months and months digging. And they've planned it precisely this way. So that also, too, means when you've got a guy who's popping up in a position you think you've secured, you're probably pretty vulnerable at that point. And you're going to get some pretty serious enfilade or flanking fire. And so you can imagine that slows down the advance. Now, the Americans get across the island fairly quickly, within a day and a half or so. And they cut off Mount Suribachi from the rest of the Japanese, farther, I guess it would be the north on the island. But it kind of hardly mattered because wherever you're encountering them, they're generally going to fight to the death.
You mentioned the Marines that had combat experience before, and of course John Basilone, most famously, who had earned himself a Medal of Honor on Guadalcanal. I was also reading an account recently about a couple of officers who had served a long time in the Marines and were fighting at Iwo. One of them was shot and wounded quite badly, and his comrade, in an effort to sort of get him out of there and get him on his feet and get him out of there, said, "Come on, get up. You were wounded worse at Tulagi." He said, and Tulagi, of course, was the opening round of the Guadalcanal campaign, and I've been there many times. It's a fantastic story, the Battle of Tulagi. But we're talking August 42 back there. So these guys had been through a lot. If they're, if they're still there at Iwo, having landed on Tulagi on that first day of America's Pacific War. And this poor bugger who'd been wounded there as well. So it's interesting, those people that come through. But you talked about how the fighting changed from this sort of beach landing to crossing the island and then the clearing out of Suribachi. Again, it reminds me of Peleliu quite a lot, but there were distinct phases of the battle which changed in their nature pretty swiftly. So one minute you're trying to hit a beach, the next minute you're coming under heavy fire as you cross the inland. Now you've got to swing around, and now you're clearing Japanese out of caves as you went up Mount Suribachi. So I think that fighting in Suribachi to clear the Japanese out of those caves was certainly some of the most horrific fighting of the campaign, and the most iconic as well. So give us a bit of an overview of what this was like as the Marines slogged their way up onto the.
Yeah, so by that point, they've landed some of their artillery, and the artillery supporting the advance up Suribachi. Of course, that's the highest ground on the island, so it's going to be tough no matter what happens. They've got some positions there, the Japanese do, that are protected by steel doors. So, what are you going to be able to do? I mean, it's basically a series of frontal attacks at times to just go and take this. And that's an infantry mission. It's an engineer mission. Tanks really can't maneuver that much up Suribachi. There's going to be a lot of tanks in use on Iwo, but it would probably be more fire support for us as we go up, that kind of thing. So it's kind of just cave to cave, clearing them out. And this is the focus of the fighting, much of it, for the first 4 days or so. And then famously on February 23rd, the Marines do secure Suribachi. And I say secure, I put that maybe in quotes because I'm sure there are still wayward Japanese around who many of them are cut off, and they're probably going to fight to the end. So there's plenty of danger there, of course. But this leads to the iconic flag raising, atop Mount Suribachi, which, of course, famously, Joe Rosenthal takes the picture that is, that I would argue maybe it's the most famous picture in World War II, maybe overall, but maybe certainly when we think of American military history, it's one of the most famous, if not the most, and iconic. So, but it's misunderstood at the time because pretty much every Marine on that island, and I should mention, too, the naval support people, too, the beach masters, the logistical people, the CBs who are going to be in play once we have the airfield, and, of course, the corpsmen who are attached to the Marines who are a part of this, too. So the Marines and the sailors who are on this island look up and they see the flag, and they think that means the island is secured. And so there's this great cheer that goes up, I think, with that kind of misunderstanding, when actually on some level the battle was just beginning. But obviously it's a key moment, and it's impacted by the fact that the Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, was there. And, famously he wants because there was a first flag raising, he wants that flag, and it leads to the second flag raising and all this stuff that becomes kind of legendary, of course. And he's thinking like a defense policy administrator when he sees the flag raising. He says that's going to mean a Marine Corps for the next 1,000 years. And, there's no question that it's associated with the Marine Corps to this day.
Enjoy a brilliant sleep experience with Soundcore from Anchor. Stressed out by your partner's snoring? Having trouble falling asleep? Waking up too easily? Suffering from poor quality sleep? Now, put on Soundcore Sleep A20 earbuds. Experience unparalleled pressure-free comfort perfect for side sleepers. Choose your favorite sound in your curated playlist. Feel your body getting lighter and lighter, and enjoy a full night of peaceful sleep with the A20's long-lasting battery. Then wake up feeling fresh with a personal built-in alarm. Get the sleep you deserve with Soundcore Sleep A20 earbuds. Discover more on soundcore.com. SOUNDCORE. Soundcore. Use code SLEEP at checkout to get $30 off. SLEEP in all caps.
Weight loss. It needs to be fast and sustainable. Noom GLP-1 starts at just $149 and ships to your door in 7 days. Take it from Lauren, who lost 22 pounds on Noom.
If I come off of the GLP-1, it's not going to automatically make my weight yo-yo back.
$149 GLP-1s? Now that's Noom smart. Get started at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. Individual results may vary. Not all customers will medically qualify for prescription medications. Compounded medications are not reviewed by the FDA for safety, efficacy, or quality.
It is one of those iconic moments. We'll talk a little bit later in the discussion of just about the cultural impact of Iwo Jima. But it's a fascinating story. Is that the fact that the flag went up, the first flag raising, which should have been the important one, was kind of the one, the one that gets overlooked now, and the second one, which was a little bit more staged and a little bit more, managed, and the photographer was there and the cameraman. There's great, moving footage of it as well. That's the one everyone remembers. But the poor blokes, and different guys involved in both flag raisings. So the poor guys that were involved in the first one, which was the legit one, you would say, when the flag went up, get a little bit overlooked. But I visited, many of the people involved in both flag raisings didn't survive the battle. And when I was in Hawaii a few years ago, I visited all their graves at Punch Bowl Cemetery. And just each one's just got this amazing story. So again, if people are going to Hawaii, go to Punch Bowl Cemetery and see the huge expanse of graves from across the Pacific War. It tells an amazing story. But Suribachi is iconic, the flag raising. But of course, as you said, the battle didn't end there. What came after Suribachi, and what was required to finally secure the island? So
the Marines had most of the first airfield already. Then it was a push for the second one. It's like the sequence of airfields called Motoyama 1, 2, and 3. And so over the next couple of weeks, it's just a matter of going and grabbing the rest of those airfields. But then you've got to get a lot of the higher ground that's in the outcroppings there. Like Hill 362A would be one that I would just give as one example. And in many cases, you're talking about positions that are more or less impervious to a lot of your supporting fire. And you're talking about a situation in which the enemy is willing to fight to the death or is peer pressured into it, whatever it means, they're going to fight. And so this is just absolutely a meat grinder, so casualty intensive. Now, I'm giving you sort of a notional kind of scenario, but what is all too common is, let's say we're in a Marine rifle company that has an assignment to go and grab an objective, usually a couple 100 yards, something like that, or a series of caves, whatever it be. We're probably looking at anywhere from 15 to 40% casualties just in that one small unit action. And then guess what? We wake up and we do it again the next day. And at night, as usual, there are Japanese infiltrators who are coming into the lines, and these close-in struggles. There are also, courtesy of General Kuribayashi, more coordinated local counterattacks versus wasteful banzai charges straight into our firepower kind of thing. And those attacks tend to be at night, some of them, which is, I think the Japanese really have a better sense of how to maximize operating at night, maybe than the Americans do, even at this stage of the war. So all of that is leading to just kind of this slaughterhouse, this meat grinder campaign in which these three divisions are just being bled out. And, this isn't like a situation where you can bring in more reserve divisions or whatever. You kind of got what you got here because, true, you have one Marine division in reserve, the 2nd Marine Division, and, the 1st and the 6th, they're going to be earmarked to invade Okinawa, so they can't help you. But the 2nd is earmarked to be reserved for Okinawa as well. So, and unless you want to turn around hat in hand and say, hey, U.S. Army, can you send in one of your divisions that was going to be going to the Philippines or whatever? And obviously we know the Marines don't want to do that. So you could just imagine the horrible situation you've got here. From their point of view, from the Japanese point of view, it's much worse because every guy they lose simply can't be replaced on any level. And, they're just fighting this self-sacrificial battle to bleed the Americans the best they can, and they're doing a heck of a job at it. Well, we see the Marines fighting their way across the island. Eventually, a few weeks later, they secure it, and the last Japanese are killed or captured, and that's the end of the story for Iwo Jima. But we get this famous figure. I mean, the casualties are horrific. We're talking more than 20,000 each on both sides. So, we're talking close to 50,000. I think 23,000 is something the casualty list that's often put around, and it's also claimed, factually, that this was pretty much the only battle of the Pacific War where American casualties were higher than the Japanese, and that is very true, and that does paint a picture of how savage the fighting was. But I did want to put a little asterisk next to that often gets overlooked, is that the American casualties obviously included the wounded. So I think we're talking 6,000 or 7,000 Americans were killed, whereas the Japanese were virtually, except for a tiny percentage of wounded, the Japanese were nearly all killed in action. So we're talking 23,000-ish casualties. But for Japanese, that's mostly killed, and for the Americans, that includes a large portion of wounded. So
I mean, it's not a numbers game, but I think both points are valid, that it does illustrate just the huge cost to the Americans to take this island. But also it demonstrates the Japanese mentality to fight to the death, because there were not many prisoners taken, and not many wounded were captured either. So, just a horrific battle in the midst of horrific battles. So, would you stand by that and saying that Iwo Jima was the worst, if one of the worst, if not the worst battle of the Pacific War?
Maybe per capita in that sense, but no, I think Okinawa was worse. It's a bigger battle. The casualties are absolutely staggering. I think we lose 12,000 killed. From a U.S. Navy perspective, it's the deadliest battle in the history of the U.S. Navy. And it's, the Army and the Marines bleed on Okinawa horribly. And of course, the Japanese have a force of about 100,000 there. So that's almost 5 times what they've got on Iwo Jima. It's just that Iwo Jima, I think maybe if we're talking about, microcosmic, like per capita, I mean, you can't imagine anything worse. And I think that's true. I also think too, by the way, what's going on in the Philippines is also on a larger scale, on Luzon and, the Battle of Manila that's happening at the same time that Iwo Jima is happening, by the way. All of that is just horrendous. So it's all part of this larger picture of a war that's getting bloodier as we reach the end of it on some level. So, yeah, there's about 6,700 Americans killed. The wounded, of course, obviously they survive. Many of them, of course, are disabled for life. Or even if you don't necessarily have physical wounds, there are other kinds of wounds that people have from Iwo Jima, the trauma of it, of course. I mean, just in terms of the KIA ratios, though, I think they're quite staggering. And the way we always see that, I think, is just to think about the flag raisers, like you said, Matt. A lot of them didn't survive the battle. And that's right there. That tells you, it's like, wow, these were pretty high fatality rates. And I think that's what's really quite disturbing about the battle in the long run, that if you happen to be on the sharp end of it, there was a better chance you were going to be killed here than in your typical World War II battle as an American, I guess. And, so that was what was maybe a cautionary tale, that you didn't expect to have KIA rates as high as they were, where it really would be possible to have a rifle company where you're losing 30%, 40% KIA or whatever. That doesn't always happen, even in the sharpest battles in Europe or even in other parts of the Pacific.
Was it worth it, John, this immense casualty rate, particularly on the American side? Was it worth the cost in blood to capture this little volcanic rock?
It's such a tough question to answer, and it's an emotional question that I've seen the evolution of this, the thinking over this, like almost in the course of my life. And it was almost an article of faith, I think, for decades, that Iwo had to be taken, that, it was terrible, but it just simply had to be taken because of the aerial campaign. Otherwise, the aerial campaign would have been much worse. That Iwo ended up as a really good relief place for the B-29s. And horrible though it was, almost like the Marine sacrifice for the Army Air Forces in a way. Now, of course, I think we've re-examined that in the last 20, 25 years more. And I think, in a way, the generation that fought the battle almost had to be gone or going by the time we could really think this way, because it's, if you fought there, you'd have to believe it's for something. And that was like the standard thinking. But I think the more we kind of deconstruct this now, I think it's very questionable, because we don't hardly use it at all as a relief landing place. The Japanese didn't have the early warning system that we thought they did. The U.S. fighters that are based there have really no impact on the bombing campaign against Japan. So Iwo is useful, but not for the price we pay for it, I think. So I don't know. I think it's hard to justify on some levels. It's But Iwo's not alone in that regard. I think we'd all agree Peleliu probably shouldn't have been fought. There are parts of the Philippines campaign where you'd say, I don't know, we really needed to fight there. I mean, it's always tough to decide, do we need this or not? But Iwo, I think, is very, very questionable.
It's a good point you make, John, that, and again, hindsight is a wonderful thing. I'm sure had the planners looked at Peleliu, for example, and realized that they wouldn't actually need that airfield for, the Philippines campaign, they might not have decided it was worth the immense casualties to take that little rock, that maybe we just bypass it like they'd done in New Britain and other islands, which appears to be a very effective strategy. New Britain, Bougainville, these places that had huge garrisons and could have been their own Iwo Jimas or Tarawas or Pelelius. They simply bypassed them and left the Japanese to basically starve in the jungle. That was also an effective strategy, but obviously we had to fight the Japanese somewhere. we couldn't skip every island. We had to fight somewhere. And I agree with you. I think I'm always in two minds about Iwo Jima. It seemed worthwhile, and you see people try to justify it. You see, X hundreds of crippled B-29s managed to crash land there, and the crews were saved, and but then you just the cost to acquire what is strategically just a little rock in the middle of the ocean. I don't think we'll ever have an answer. As we say, the history's fixed. Nothing's going to change about what went on. All we have is interpretation. So I think the arguments will continue long into the future. Before we go, John, let's talk a little bit about the cultural impact of Iwo Jima, because again, we draw a lot of comparisons with a place like Peleliu or Tarawa or these other islands that were so hard fought over. But those islands have virtually disappeared from our collective memories. You have to be quite a war nerd to ever have heard of Peleliu and its role in the Pacific War. Iwo Jima rises above that. It is a culturally very significant battle. It's one of the handful of iconic Second World War battles in the Pacific. I think even Okinawa, I agree with you that was obviously a larger and bloodier campaign, but I don't think it holds the iconic place of Iwo Jima. We've had scores of movies and books about Iwo Jima. We've had, recently, in the last 15 years or so, we had Clint Eastwood doing 2 films about Iwo Jima, Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima, from both the American and Japanese perspective. And in my opinion, I think the Japanese one was actually a lot stronger than the American perspective.
Yep.
In the Pacific, 15 years ago in the Pacific, Iwo Jima featured as one of the key battles, mostly in telling the story of John Basilone, who was killed there. Is it because of the photo that it's become iconic? Is the photo and the war bond drive and the bringing people together in the final stages of the war, is that the reason we remember Iwo Jima so strongly?
I think the photo is a big part of it, but I also think it's who's fighting there, the Marine Corps. And the Marine Corps has to preserve and tell its history better than anybody else in order to continue to exist. And they're really, really, really good at it. And the Marines they had already, but they still do capture the imagination of the American public as our sort of self-sacrificial elite warriors on many levels. And there's a great deal of truth to that. The photo seems to encapsulate all of that. Just in this one image, and it's got the flag in it too. And of course, the evidence of Iwo Jima's enduring cultural impact, you can see in the Washington, D.C. area, the Marine Corps Memorial there that portrays the flag raising. And, that's I think that was dedicated in 1956, something like that. So pretty soon after the war. So, and then of course the Sands of Iwo Jima had come out. John Wayne himself, I think that comes out in 1949, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, so already it's right there in our cultural radar, and it influences untold numbers of generations of Americans, and many of them to join the Marine Corps, to be like John Wayne or whatever. There are 22 Medal of Honor recipients that come from the battle. Every single one of them obviously had such incredible valor, and for every one of them, I'm sure there could have been more. The last living Medal of Honor recipient came from the Battle of Iwo Jima, Woody Williams, who just died a couple of years ago, who was a flamethrower guy, by the way. And so I think all of this lives in our popular memory as the best of ourselves on some level. And I think maybe the flag raising represents that. It also is, I think it's very meaningful. You can't see the faces of the guys raising the flag, and maybe somehow that's appropriate, that they're individuals, but they're not. And there's just something about it that really grabs us. I think if there's anything unfortunate, it's that the footage, the incredible color footage we have, shot by Bill Janost, who also lost his life in this battle, that we don't know that as well, who did that. And I think he deserves a lot more acclaim because he was absolutely remarkable. And so he shows the footage all over, some of the most ferocious fighting, the flag raising, so on and so forth. But all that combines, I think, to just kind of create this kind of cultural lodestone that still exists today. Now, I'll point out, in saying that too, I'll point out that it isn't Normandy. I mean, this country kind of stops whenever there's a marker anniversary of D-Day. And so you can see, okay, that's different. And maybe the Battle of the Bulge on some level too, because again, that's Europe. So it's a little more kind of relatable, I think, for the average American. Iwo is not in that category, but it's certainly, in the conversation. And it's, certainly, I think both the Japanese Americans would agree it's hallowed ground.
Well, there's something also pretty obvious that I, as a tour guide as well, that comes up all the time is you can go to Normandy. You can stand on Omaha Beach. You can, you can go to the Ardennes and walk through the forest where the Battle of the Bulge was fought. You can go to Italy and and stand where the Italian campaign was fought. You can't get to Iwo Jima. Have you actually been there, John, to Iwo?
I have not been to Iwo Jima, no.
No, I haven't either. It's the one I was due to go whatever year the Japanese tsunami occurred, and obviously that was a huge tragedy, and my heart goes out to the people, but I was due to go the day after the tsunami occurred, so that trip got cancelled.
Oh my gosh.
Back. So
wow.
It's very tightly restricted. It's still a Japanese defense base. It's very tightly restricted. It's my one big ambition as a historian is to get to Iwo one day. So I think they still do a trip. I mean, they're probably slowing down now, but they did take veterans back for one day every year. I'm not sure if those tours are still going on now that there's so few veterans left, but I hope to get there one day. John, you'll have to join me. That'll be our big tour of the various sites of the Pacific, culminating with Iwo Jima. It's an incredible story, mate, and you brought it to life so well. I'm so grateful to you. I think it's really important that we revisit these chapters, particularly of the Pacific War, because it does get overlooked. And it's just worth remembering. It's worth remembering on a strategic level, on a political level, on a national level, but also on a very human level as well, what these people went through. So thank you, as always, for bringing it to life. It's a really compelling story, and I'm glad we got to talk about it today. Yeah, me too. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it. Well, we'll see you again soon, John, to talk more stories of World War II. But in the meantime, check out everything John's doing. Particularly with We Have Ways podcast with Jim and Al, is always great to hear John's voice. So we'll catch up again soon, John. Thank you very much. Sounds good, Matt. Thanks for everything. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast, and visit livinghistoryytv.com for more great history content.
Enjoy a brilliant sleep experience with Soundcore from Anchor. Stressed out by your partner's snoring? Having trouble falling asleep? Waking up too easily? Suffering from poor quality sleep? Now, put on Soundcore Sleep A20 earbuds. Experience unparalleled pressure-free comfort perfect for side sleepers. Choose your favorite sound in your curated playlist. Feel your body getting lighter and lighter and enjoy a full night of peaceful sleep with the A20's long-lasting battery. Then wake up feeling fresh with a personal built-in alarm. Get the sleep you deserve with Soundcore Sleep A20 earbuds. Discover more on soundcore.com. SOUNDCORE. Soundcore. Use code SLEEP at checkout to get $30 off. SLEEP in all caps.
Hi, I'm Raj Punjabi from HuffPost.
And I'm Noah Michelson, also from HuffPost.
And we're the hosts of Am I Doing It Wrong? A new podcast that explores the all-too-human anxieties we have about trying to get our lives right.
Each week on the podcast, Raj and I pick a new topic that we want to understand better and bring a guest expert on to talk us through how to get it right.
And we're talking like legit, credible experts. Doctors, PhDs, all-around superheroes.
From HuffPost and Acast Studios, check out Am I Doing It Wrong? Wherever you get your podcasts.
Did you know 39% of teen drivers admit to texting while driving? Even scarier, those who text are more likely to speed and run red lights. Shockingly, 94% know it's dangerous, but do it anyway. As a parent, you can't always be in the car, but you can stay connected to their safety with Greenlight Infinity's driving reports. Monitor their driving habits, see if they're using their phone, speeding, and more. These reports provide real data for meaningful conversations about safety. Plus, with weekly updates, you can track their progress over time. Help keep your teens safe. Sign up for Greenlight Infinity at greenlight.com/podcast.
Hello, it's Mat McLachlan. Before we get to this week's podcast, I wanted to extend a very special invitation to you. In August 2025, my signature tour is heading back to the Western Front, and I'd love you to come with me. We're going to explore the battlefields of France and Belgium and tell the entire story of the Australians during the First World War. It's going to be an amazing trip. We're going to visit the Somme, we're going to visit the Ypres Salient, French Flanders, famous battlefields such as Passchendaele, Pozieres, Villers-Bretonneux, Bullecourt, Fromelles, and many more. Now, this is the only tour I'm going to personally escort to the Western Front in 2025. So if you'd like to come with me, please don't wait. The tour sells out very, very quickly. It departs Paris on the 30th of August, 2025, and you can find full information at our website, which is battlefields.com.au.